When the world starts to feel heavy, my first instinct is to pull closer to home, not out of fear, but because I've learned that steadiness doesn't begin out there. It begins right here in the small, ordinary work that keeps a home steady. Our great-grandmothers lived by quiet rhythms, kneading bread, folding laundry, lighting lamps against the dark. They weren't chasing calm, they were creating it, one small act at a time. It makes me think that peace doesn't come from getting everything right, but from caring enough to keep showing up, to cook, to mend, to make something out of what's in front of you. I'm Megan, the 5th generation raised on our family's farm, nestled in the Appalachian Mountains. These days, my husband and our 2 daughters and I live about 30 minutes away in a beautiful 1908 Victorian farmhouse, a place that's teaching us to love where we are, even as we look forward to someday moving back to the homestead. Here in these mountains, the old ways never disappeared. They just kept going quietly in the background. And maybe that's why I keep sharing these small pieces of home, because I still believe they hold the wisdom we need to find peace in uncertain times. On this day, we were making homemade noodles, the old Better Homes and Gardens recipe. If you've ever seen that red and white gingham cover, you know exactly the one. It's the same cookbook that sat open on our grandmother's counters. Flowers in the spine, pages soft from use, and the measurements memorized more than read. It's funny how that book never really went out of style. Maybe because food like this never belonged to a trend. It belonged to a way of life, a time when supper was less about the recipe and more about keeping people gathered and grateful. Flour, eggs, salt, and water. That's it. And as I work the dough, I can almost hear the quiet rhythm of women who came before me. My great-grandmother among them, raising 10 children through long Appalachian winters when store-bought wasn't an option and everything depended on the work of your hands. Back then, a meal like this wasn't about nostalgia. It was about survival. The garden, the cellar, the milk cow, that was their grocery list. They stretched everything. Flour sacks turned into aprons, bacon grease saved in a jar, beans cooked 3 different ways before the week was done. But there was pride in that kind of living, not shame. They didn't have convenience, but they had competence. And that's something worth remembering. My daughter stands beside me, her little hands clumsy but determined, trying to roll the dough and cut it just right. Her lines wander off course, but perfect isn't the point. In fact, I think that's what those women understood better than we do. That doing the work faithfully mattered more than doing it flawlessly. When the outside world feels unsteady, we still have the choice to create steadiness right here, not through grand gestures, but through small ones. Lighting a candle at breakfast, cooking supper when we're tired, setting the table even when it's just our little family. Those things seem ordinary, but they become the rhythm that reminds everyone we're still okay. While the dough rests, I brown one of the last roasts we have from the beeves we processed last fall. We have all but run out of hamburger, but thankfully we'll get our freezer filled in a few short weeks with a quarter beef and a half hog. Which reminds me, the bottom of our freezer is full of hog fat needing to be rendered into lard. I'll be adding this to my to-do list to tackle in the next few weeks or so. These seasonal rhythms are what we rely on. It's hard but necessary work, and it gives us a sense of belonging. To know that what's on our table came from soil we've tended to and animals that we've cared for. My dad has told many stories about visiting his grandmothers growing up. He always mentions how they didn't have much, but if you ever left their home with an empty belly, it was your own fault. And I think there's truth in that. They didn't measure wealth in dollars. They measured it in shelves lined with jars. a full wood pile, and neighbors who'd show up when the barn roof needed mending. That's how Appalachian communities made it through the hardest times. Families lived close, often 3 generations under one roof. When my grandpa was born, his grandparents were living in the same small Appalachian farmhouse. You helped harvest your neighbor's wheat, you shared canning lids when someone ran short, and sent a pie across the fence just because you had extra eggs that week. Nobody had much, but together they had enough. If you're a mother tending to your home while caring for little hearts, and you're feeling the weight of this season, remember, your children are going to remember those simple little things of home. They'll remember the smell of something warm from the kitchen, the sound of laughter echoing down the hallway, and the way you made ordinary days feel safe. That's the quiet work of home, the kind our grandmothers knew by heart. It doesn't change the world out there, but it shapes the hearts growing up inside these walls. And give yourself a little grace in these seasons of motherhood. And relying on community and family was never historically considered a weakness. Rather, it was one of the biggest strengths that helped us carry each other through some of the hardest of times. While the noodles were drying on this day, I started to peel some golden delicious apples for fried apples in my great aunt's cast iron skillet. She was one of the best cooks I knew, and a woman who somehow made homemaking look both effortless and holy. I never met my great-grandma, but I felt closer to her standing in that old farmhouse kitchen beside my aunt, watching her tend the same old wood cook stove before it was replaced by an electric one, using her mother's laundry basket, and stirring the same skillet I'm holding now. It's funny how something as simple as frying apples can pull generations into the same moment. The sizzle and the smell of cinnamon and butter, they remind me that what we're really doing in these kitchens isn't just cooking, it's remembering. And in a world that moves too fast, remembering might just be one of the most radical things we can do. Sometimes I'll make a batch of these noodles ahead and freeze them. They hold up beautifully for quick soups on busy days. Other times I'll double the broth and turn what's left into a simple vegetable soup later in the week. It's the kind of cooking that our great-grandmothers would have done without thinking. Practical, frugal, but still full of comfort. Because even when the world outside feels uncertain, we can still do this. We can try to put that meal on the table, light a candle, call everyone in. That's how peace starts. Not in the big fixes, but in the small, faithful things we keep doing at home. The garden looks so different now. Dry corn stalks rustle in the wind, the last song of summer. This was the first year that my oldest planted the corn herself. She was so proud when we finally harvested it. I can't help but wonder how many more seasons I'll get to watch her grow alongside what she plants. By next spring, she'll have grown taller, and with her growth comes mine. And patience and slowing down and learning the quiet art of tending without hurry. I have my husband out here cutting down the old stalks now, using a corn knife we found tucked away in the shed on the farm. I don't even know how old it is, but I know whose hands once held it. That's the thing about tools around here. They carry stories. Every nick, every worn handle, proof that the ordinary work can outlast the ones who started it. It's sad to see the seasons change, but I love fall. We're gonna bundle these dried stalks and set some aside for the porch. Nothing fancy, just twine left over from feeding hay to the animals. I love decorating this way, using what the season gives us before it fades. It feels honest, and it ties the garden to the home in a way store-bought things just can't. While we gather the last of the corn, we noticed a few bean pods still clinging to the vines. They'll dry and be perfect for saving seed. If you've never saved seeds, it's as simple as letting the pods fully dry, shelling them, and storing the beans in a labeled envelope. Little by little, you build your own seed collection, one season feeding the next. This is how it had always been done. No shopping for seed each spring. They saved it, a quiet form of self-sufficiency that kept their families fed year after year. There are still a few peppers hanging on too, bright against the fading leaves. I'll add them to the stash in my freezer. One of my favorite tips for these end of season peppers is to chop them, lay them flat on a tray, and freeze them, and then transfer them into a bag so they don't all clump together. It makes winter meals so much easier. A quick handful into soup or stews or gravy, and you have just a taste of summer again. Then there are my dahlias. Still standing, though they've seen the bite of the first frost. Their edges have browned and are curling, but they're still beautiful in their own way. Once the frost has fully taken them, I'll dig up the tubers and brush off the soil and tuck them away in sawdust or peat for the winter. If you've ever overwintered dahlias, it's worth trying. One small bit of care now gives you blooms again next summer without spending a dime. When I was little, I remember planting my Aunt Bunny's dahlias in the garden. I never met her, but her dahlias were always so beautiful and a reminder of the sacredness of staying rooted to the past. The work feels slower in the fall, but somehow more meaningful. You can see what the land has given and what it's held and what it's still teaching. Every little task of saving seed, freezing peppers, bundling stalks feels like a quiet thank you for another season. To the women who've walked through uncertain times before, what helped you create peace at home when the world felt shaky? Your words matter here. Leave a bit of your wisdom in the comments below so the rest of us, the younger mothers and homemakers, can gather it up like light in the dark. Because when we share what's helped us endure, we remind each other that hope still lives here and home will always be enough. Later on this particular afternoon, I light an almost burnt out candle, the same one that's been flickering on our counter for weeks. And I start working on a new recipe I've been testing, a sourdough apple cider donut cake. I've been tweaking this one for a while, trying to get that balance between the tang of sourdough and the cozy sweetness of apple cider. If you've ever baked with sourdough, you know it teaches patience. You can't rush making the starter, and it decides when it's ready. Kind of like the rest of life, really. You can find this recipe along with more heirloom favorites and simple kitchen rhythms at ourhomeandheritage.com. And if you'd like, you can join my weekly email where I'll share a recipe and routines and reflections that keep our farmhouse kitchen running with purpose. Have you ever noticed that there's something so steadying about baking? The familiar rhythm of measuring and stirring and waiting. When it comes to making this cake, I like to use a bubbly active starter. It gives it that soft, tender crumb. If yours has been sitting in the fridge, feed it a few hours before you start. It'll reward you with a better rise and flavor. And this is the kind of recipe that you don't want to overmix. Once the dry ingredients go in, you're going to fold them gently until the batter comes together. That's what keeps it light instead of dense. And always, always butter the bundt pan generously. Get into every little curve and dust it with sugar instead of flour, in this case, if you want that crisp golden crust that crackles ever so slightly when you slice it. Sometimes I'll make 2 small cakes instead of 1 large one to keep and one to share. That's another thing I've learned from years of baking. It doesn't take much more effort to double the joy. Drop one off with a neighbor or slice and freeze half weeknight. These little habits, baking ahead, freezing extras, keeping a jar of starter always ready, they make home life run smoother without feeling so rushed. When this cake comes out of the oven, because it's in the bundt pan, you're going to want to let it rest for a little bit. That pause between the work and the reward feels symbolic, doesn't it? Everything good seems to need that space to settle and strengthen. I've learned the hard way that cutting into anything, a loaf of bread, a day, even a season, too short, can undo the work that's been happening quietly inside. As I brush melted butter over the warm cake and then sprinkle the cinnamon and sugar, the scent of apple and spice fills the kitchen. And I think about how every generation before us had their own ways of getting through uncertain seasons. My great-grandmother baked with her fresh milled flour she grew in her fields, fried apples from the orchard across the hill, and she used whatever she had on hand. Her kitchen probably smelled just as comforting, and maybe this is our modern version of that. Keeping steady by tending to what's right in front of us. Because maybe peace isn't found in what we can control, but in the faithfulness of what we keep tending. Day after day, the bread we bake, the meals we share, the prayers whispered over folding laundry and sleepy little heads. So wherever you are watching this, I hope you find a bit of steadiness here, a reminder that even when the world feels unsteady, our homes can still be that last safe place. Here's to making home the calm when the world feels unsteady. Until next time, friend.